Hey, it's Chris. I really enjoyed making the last one of these kind of speed draw and chat about nerd things videos, so I figured I'd give it another go and keep learning and work on my crippling fear of recording my voice and see how it goes. A couple things art process wise, actually, as I'm getting used to recording my drawing process and looking back at the footage there are a few things I figured I'd just bring up real quick before we get into the fun stuff for this video in terms of the practical side of my process. So, one thing that you might see, it happens pretty quickly with the way that I have to speed up the recording for these types of videos just so that it doesn't take 3 hours for anything to get done because I'm a kind of slow worker. But even at the speed that I need to have these videos at, I think you'll see occasionally that my colors will just kind of go wild every now and then, or at least like one color at a time will just go to the rave and start flickering every which direction. That's because I found that with digital illustration, I am much more free and flexible with my color palettes if I just put down a color that I think more or less works to start with, and then after the fact, open up the window in Clip Studio that allows me to alter the tone and saturation and luminosity and everything and see where that color could go after the fact instead of getting really locked into the first color that I put down. I've stumbled upon some really fun color palettes that way. So if you are doing digital illustration and that's not a habit you're already in, I do super recommend it. Most illustration softwares give you so much flexibility with your colors and the ability to edit things so easily as you're working. So just my recommendation being don't get too locked into the first color that you put down. And yeah, so you might see that periodically. You might see my colors go kind of wild for a little bit while I adjust things and see if what I have down on the image is what I actually want to work with. Other than that, I already mentioned I'm using Clip Studio. I was using Photoshop for a little while. It was a generation old, I think. I think I was working with CS5 and now they're on CS6, I believe. And my version was also maybe kind of sort of not fully legal, so that's fine. That's cool. But I didn't find that to be preferable for the type of work I was doing. It didn't feel like a very organic or natural process for me. Clip Studio, I can definitely recommend if you're doing the type of illustration I'm doing. It does feel like a much easier transition from traditional to digital, working with the tools that they have available. And then as a final note, Artwise Brushes, primarily for my line art, I've been keeping it pretty simple. I've been just using a hard edge pen brush with pressure sensitivity on for most of my line art. I would like to experiment with that a little bit moving forward. I know some people do some really interesting things with that, but that's for some experimentations in the future. And then coloring wise, like you'll see in this recording that I have playing, I'm mostly using watercolor brushes for my shading these days. I find that the way the watercolor brushes work in Clip Studio allows me to smush my colors around a little bit and sometimes get some really nice soft gradients from one shade to the next, but also still create really good, crisp, hard contours for some of the shading when I need that. So I guess that's everything I can think of right now, housekeeping wise. So hopefully that was a little bit of good insight into the process anyway. If you think of anything else you're curious about in terms of the art making side of these videos, definitely just let me know. I take a lot of my process for granted, so I might not always realize when I'm doing something that, might be interesting or might be confusing to somebody else. So definitely bring that up to me. Now, the fun stuff. The fun stuff is going to be rambling about the plot of Kingdom Hearts, because who can ever get enough of that, right? So before we get into the meat of this, I do want to make a couple obligatory disclaimers. If we lived in a perfect world, we wouldn't have to do this, but we're, on the internet, so disclaimers have to exist, right? So First of all, a blanket spoiler warning for pretty much the entire Kingdom Hearts series. I want to be able to talk pretty freely about what I've been thinking about this series plot-wise, so I really don't want to have to tiptoe around details. So, spoiler warning across the board for that. Second thing would be this idea that I want to talk about. It relates to the framework through which I've been looking at Kingdom Hearts' plot. And it's not necessarily a hard thesis that I'm ready to make like a Lindsay Ellis style video essay on. I have so much respect for how she and other YouTubers do that, because this is just an idea that I'm still solidifying and that I would love feedback on, and that I'm still sort of discovering new things about as we go. And then third and finally, I want to put the disclaimer out there that when I'm talking about the plot of Kingdom Hearts, or really most video games, most media even, I know that there's always cynical monetary motivations for why plots and certain developments occur, right? Like any mature person who watches or absorbs any amount of media knows that arguably one of the largest motivations for making a plot and putting it out into the market is to gain money. I get that. I have no delusions about Kingdom Hearts being this pure piece of art that's completely free from the influence of fans and fan service. But because I don't exactly have Nomura on speed dial, and I can't like call him up and be like, hey, like, why did this character come back to life 3 times? Like, I can maybe assume that that happened because the players liked that character and they want the capital gain of having that character continue to exist in the series, but I don't know for sure. I can't confirm or deny that. So we're going to look at this from the standpoint of viewers interpreting an art piece and willfully ignore the business side of things, because I have no way of quantifying any of that. Does that make sense? So, yeah, I think with that, I think we're ready to talk like adults, right? Basically, what I wanted to put forth to you guys in this, to anybody who's even slightly invested in the plot and the story writing side of Kingdom Hearts, is that it makes a lot more sense if you approach Kingdom Hearts as a fairy tale, where the feelings and concepts being put forth take the primary spot of importance where plot and coherence normally would. And I'm gonna explain what in the world I mean by that, but I wanted to put that idea in your head first, right? Kingdom Hearts works on fairy tale logic, and that's a good thing. So I started thinking about this because I had watched this video, so funny video on YouTube. I wish I could remember who does it. I'll put the link down in the description. But most Kingdom Hearts fans that I know of have seen this at least once. But it's the Good Enough Summary of Kingdom Hearts video. Hysterical stuff. Highly recommend it. But he makes this comment at the beginning that I'm sure was mostly just a joke, but that kind of wiggled its way into my brain and got me actually thinking about things. Like, wait a minute, actually though, there might be something to that. He says something to the effect of, I find this easier to take in if you think of it more as an avant-garde art piece rather than a traditional narrative. And that sounds ridiculous, you know, because it's Kingdom Hearts, it's anime and Disney and Final Fantasy, right? But, like, actually, though. So I started thinking, well, maybe there's something to that. Maybe not necessarily as an art piece at a museum, but maybe there is a better angle to approach this narrative from that would make it much more satisfying than try to piece it together like a puzzle. I think most people who are even passingly familiar with Kingdom Hearts knows that it has this reputation as being one of the most convoluted franchises out there. Half of the main cast is actually in some way just like another iteration of an existing character. They've got like this Russian nesting doll of identities. And like there's egos being split and recombined all over the place. There's time travel now because, like, of course, thank you for that, Nomura. Love that for us. And I've done pretty well at keeping up with all of this. I adore these games. I'm critical of them because I adore them, right? And so I've done a pretty good job of keeping up with the timeline and everything, and watching videos on trying to piece this together, and analysis and in-depth deep dives into the plot and everything. But the more I got invested in that side of things, the more it seemed to push back against me. And there were still moments where even I looked at the series and just had to shrug and say, like, forget it, man, it's Kingdom Hearts, you know? It's gonna do what it's gonna do. Kingdom Hearts doesn't care whether I understand it or not. It's just gonna live its life, right? And so I started thinking, why doesn't it feel satisfying to put one event in front of the other and try to lay out this logical timeline? It just felt like this fruitless effort. And even the people who seemed to have the firmest grasp on it still seemed to either be willfully ignoring certain elements that didn't make sense, or getting frustrated at certain times and being like, plot hole, blah, does not compute. So that's what eventually led me to this idea of, okay, what if making logical sense of this narrative is completely not the point? What if that actually doesn't matter even a little bit? So that's where this whole fairy tale angle comes in. What I mean by fairy tale logic in this context is that the events that happen don't logically have to follow from one to the next. They don't necessitate one another. Certain events can happen because of the message they send or the feeling they evoke, rather than because a thing happened and the next logical thing just has to happen as a direct result. So, to kind of explain why I'm relating this to fairy tales, I was thinking about some familiar ones. It's not really shocking and edgy anymore to say that the original Disney fairy tales, or I say Disney fairy tales because most of us know them through the Disney films, right? So it's not really like a shocking thing to say that those used to be much darker and much more violent and much, as we would now say, edgier than we understand them to be these days. So in the original Cinderella fairy tale, of course, there's this classic moment at the end where crows appear and peck out the ugly stepsister's eyeballs. And it's very cool. Don't get me wrong, I love it. But, like, why on earth does that happen? If I were a YouTuber trying to create a logical timeline of the Cinderella fairy tale, I would look at that and be like, that came out of nowhere. What a plot hole. Like, does Cinderella control birds now? Does she have avian mind control powers? And if she did have those powers, is it even in character necessarily for her to use them in this way? We haven't been led to believe that she's a vindictive person at all. In fact, that's the opposite of her character development up until that point. And even putting aside all of those questions and their answers, do we even have the information to try to approach an answer to those questions? But ultimately, the answers don't matter, because the scene happens for audience satisfaction and for narrative inertia. So the sisters get their eyes pecked out because they suck, and we hate them, and we want bad things to happen to them. And perhaps there's some form of metaphor in there for the stepsisters' vanity and the irony of them having their eyes taken out. So, you know, I'm sure there are people who have studied these things to death, so not my place. But you know what I'm saying. There are messages being sent here that matter way more than Cinderella's strange relationship with crows. But I think Kingdom Hearts pretty much functions the same way and has always been meant to function that way, but I'll get back to that later. I think it functions almost exclusively on the idea that events are going to happen out of narrative inertia and because of what we can feel and understand about ourselves and our relationships, rather than because there's this intricate puzzle piece plot being put together. looking at it this way has at least helped me personally actually appreciate the narrative drive of this series way, way more, rather than just throwing my hands up and being like, ah, screw it, it's Kingdom Hearts. I've actually found so much more meaning and so much more substance when I put away that need to create a traditional cohesive narrative and instead tuned into what these events were trying to make me feel. Going back to what I said before about how I think this series was always meant to be this way, what I frequently hear those people who get very hung up on the so-called plot holes of the series, I frequently hear them say that Kingdom Hearts has gotten confusing and ridiculous over time, and these are frequently people who are purists to the original game, and that's all fine and good. Everybody has their favorite installments in a series, that's fine. But the truth of the matter is that this series has always relied on emotional payoff over logical mechanisms. I mean, at the start of the very first game, the whole inciting incident for the entire plot is that darkness arrives at this world where previously things had been pretty chill, and one of Sora's friends turns into an evil jerk, and the other one vanishes, and we don't figure out what happened to her until much later, but it turns out that to protect her from the darkness, her heart had just yeeted itself inside of Sora's heart. We have been given absolutely no indication that that's a thing that can even happen at that point, right? Similar to the crows in Cinderella. This just happens, and there's no logical mechanism pre-established for this. And the game can give us as many half explanations for it as it wants, but that ultimately doesn't matter, because the emotional reality of this moment is that Kairi's faith in Sora and her absolute trust in him and her intimate emotional bond with him is sheltering her from this evil that's come to her world. And that matters so much more than, wait, how do hearts just pop into other hearts? What's more important is that no matter what your BS anime powers are or whatever, you're going to be nurtured and protected. You're going to need that from others sometimes. So plot-wise, this event does kind of feel like the start of a fairy tale. You know, the local lord has been turned into a beast, and for some reason all of his servants are a part of this curse too. That kind of seems honestly a dick move, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but the emotional reality is that now we want even more for that curse to be broken. Now the viewer, the listener, whatever, is more invested in the story and wants to have that emotional payoff, that catharsis. Similarly, okay, in Sleeping Beauty, the princess will die if she touches a spinning wheel needle. That is the most ridiculously convoluted and needlessly specific curse that Maleficent could possibly think of, I'm sure. She's mistress of all evil. I'm sure she had just some insta-kill spells in her back pocket, but that's the one she chose. Similarly, Kairi's heart just putting itself inside of Sora, it feels like these other beginnings of fairy tales where the point is that we need to want to feel the emotional payoff of where these events are going to go. And actually, now that I've brought up the whole spinning wheel thing in Sleeping Beauty, that actually relates really well to one of the other examples that I started thinking about. Namine in Kingdom Hearts is one of my personal biggest, what is going on kind of characters. I think she's constantly this weird spot where the developers were well, we made this one-off character to be a plot point in this one game, but now she's got fans, so I guess we have this character with memory manipulation powers that we need to figure out how to do something with now. Cool. So Namine's abilities actually, well, they felt like they related very effectively to that whole needlessly specific and convoluted spinning wheel plan from Sleeping Beauty. Namine has these memory manipulation powers, and the game tells us it's because she's a nobody created from Kairi's heart and Sora's body, in so many words. But why would that necessarily lead to memory manipulation via crayon drawings? That just seems so specific and so difficult to apply in a larger narrative. And even more strange, I've been playing the Kingdom Hearts 3 Remind DLC. I'm not totally done with it yet, so this is a point where I could totally be wrong about something. Please call me out if I'm wrong about this. I'm always looking to learn more about this series. But it seems like this DLC is implying that Namine is the one who created the Lingering Will using Terra's memories. But, like, I thought her memory manipulation thing was bound to Sora, and especially his memories of Kairi, because of how she was created. I didn't even think Namine had ever met Terra before the events of this game. So that feels like a complete ass pull, right? At least from the way I'm recalling it. Like I said, tell me if I'm wrong. Ultimately, it's kind of pointless, though, to get hung up on these logistical issues with Namine's powers. Like I said, this is the whole getting tripped up on plot holes mentality. Because what matters is that Namine was introduced in Chain of Memories, and her ability basically is the plot. And the emotional and conceptual game from this plot decision is ultimately way more meaningful than the logical steps that brought us to it. So what we can understand from Namine's ability and the place that she holds in the narrative is honestly very meaningful and has a lot of substance when you start digging into it, right? You can think about how she has this power over the protagonist's mind, which seems honestly like kind of OP. It kind of seems like an instant game ender, but we see through her relationship with the members of Organization 13 that those with power over others can still be used and manipulated by those with power over them. It's sort of this commentary on the cycle of abuse. Again, I'm not under the delusion that this was completely intentional, right? There are so many retcons and so much back and forth in the development of these games, so I'm not sitting here saying that Nomura planned this from day one. But this is the emotional payoff that we can take from it if we're willing to meet Kingdom Hearts where it's at and look at what it's trying to convey to us. We can see this element of the cycle of abuse happening. We can see Namine starting to break free from it when she's just given a lifeline from people outside of that toxic environment she's been born into, and they reach out to her and help pull her out of it, and then of course her own strength brings her to the final lap, so to speak. The other thing we can take away from this that Chain of Memories is kind of obsessed with, honestly, so this one I'm sure is much more intentional, but the idea that memory is fallible, that every time in real life, every time we recall a memory and bring it to mind, we're actually reconstructing it from the base up. We don't have this perfect filing cabinet of memory data the way we sometimes like to think we do. And so memory is fallible, memory is able to be molded and manipulated and altered over time, but it's still important and meaningful, and it still motivates Sora's actions. Sora's actually a really good vessel for this message because he is such an actionable character and honestly kind of bullheaded, but that perfectly ties into the idea that yes, his memories are being screwed around with in this game. The poor boy has suffered so much mental trauma, but that doesn't stop him from following the emotional reality that his memories are sending him. In a way, Sora is kind of the best proof for this idea that emotional reality is more important and more meaningful than logical reality in this series, because Sora is motivated almost exclusively by his own personal emotional reality, and with the exception of some situations he seems to have gotten himself in the most recent games, which I'm very interested to see where that goes, by and large, following his understanding of his own emotional reality has always brought him to a heroic place. It's always been the correct course of action that empowers him to save the people he cares about. So anyway, as I was starting to approach the series from this different framework, I started trying to pull out a lot of the different little instances that made my own more rational mind pause and be like, what the heck is going on here? And I tried to take those, specifically those points, and re-examine them from this framework. Anytime something really stood out to me as something that we didn't have a logical precedent for in the series, or that seemed to kind of just come out of nowhere, that was when it felt to me like a cue to instead reframe this as, okay, but what can I feel from this? Which sounds like some real hippie shit, but I promise you it's been much more satisfying to me that way, and I do believe that that was the intent of these moments. So I guess let's use my best boy as an example. Let's talk about Axel, which I could do a whole separate video on him. First of all, because I love him so much, and second of all, because I do think that his character arc and his personal plot is one of the best written and one of the most deeply affecting arcs in the entire Kingdom Hearts series, but that's for a different day. But one of the things that a lot of the people who try to nail down the logistics of this series get caught up on right now is why in the world he can use a Keyblade now, which I get it. Like, there isn't any reason why that should be a thing, honestly. We haven't been given any precedent for someone just showing up and deciding, yep, I have a Keyblade now. They still have a lot of room to explain this in the games moving forward, so, I mean, I'll eat my words if maybe they come back with something that does make total sense, but I personally doubt it. I think we're more likely to get, I don't know, either just hand-waved by it. We probably won't ever get an actual explanation, but I have my own theories about his Keyblade. I've kind of been thinking that maybe it might be like a counterfeit Keyblade or a fake somehow, but like I said, maybe we'll talk about that when we talk about Axel in more detail. So there's plenty of room for this to be made sense of in the future, but for right now, it does really feel like an ass pull. But when you get right down to it, it honestly doesn't matter what logical events in the series led to this. I know by now you're probably sick of me saying that, being like, your reason and your logic is stupid and doesn't matter. But it's true in this case. He's got a Keyblade because Keyblades go to those who are worthy. And he's proven time and time again through, again, one of the most uniquely tragic character arcs in the series, that he is worthy and very heroic, as a matter of fact. You know, Cinderella gets the prince because she's pure of heart and believes in her dreams. Lee/Axel gets a Keyblade because he's a hero with something to protect, which does relate to the themes of why the Keyblade exists in the narrative as a whole. We see time and time again with the other characters and their path towards acquiring and then mastering the Keyblade, that the internals of a person's heart, a person's soul, is ultimately what matters when it comes to their interactions with a Keyblade, their ability to possess and wield one, and even in a lot of ways their individual strength and ability with it. And if we look at it through that lens, yeah, of course Axel would have a Keyblade. He absolutely has the strength of character and the internal strength to possess one. And I think that is ultimately, I mean, in addition to the fact that, yes, he's a hero now, the fans really like Axel as a character. I think I read somewhere that they tried to kill him off like 3 separate times in the series, which you can see looking back. But they literally kept bringing him back just because the fans like him so much. So I get that. That's the cynical side of things that I said earlier we were going to willfully ignore. But in the internal logic of the story, it makes perfect sense because he has the inner strength to possess a Keyblade, so naturally he does. And actually, now that I've said, too, that I'm not trying to mock the idea of trying to make logical sense of a narrative, I do want to kind of double down on that idea because Lord knows I'm an extremely obnoxious and picky viewer. Like, Lord help you if a character calls something the wrong color name, or like, the furnishing in the room doesn't make sense, or they go to a location and I'm like, I worked at a place like that. That's not what it works like at all. I'm definitely nitpicky. I'm a pain in the butt to watch things with. So it's not like I'm somebody who always just accepts an illogical narrative and just shrugs and says, it's fine. I do think we should be critical of narrative structure, and I do think that we should care about plot holes, because the presence of plot holes really can be seen as a lack of care about the narrative overall, and the message of a narrative can dramatically suffer from plot holes. But the thing is, the message of Kingdom Hearts narrative doesn't really suffer from plot holes. But I do still find myself re-examining and reapproaching some things in the series, like why Riku stopped looking like Ansem the Heartless after Ansem the Wise's computer exploded in Kingdom Hearts 2, and what the hell Mickey is actually king of. None of the other worlds seem to even know or care about him, so honestly, why is he a king, and what does that even mean functionally? And why is Maleficent even in these games anymore? She seems to kind of just wander in and out of screen every now and then, her and Pete, and after the first game, their narrative purpose was pretty much served as far as I can tell, so who even knows what's going on with them anymore? So Lord knows, there are definitely things that I still get hung up on from the logical side of things, so I'm not trying to say that overall is just a fool's errand. I just think that a lot of the major moments that seem convoluted and ridiculous in this series are present for a reason, and they're present because of what we can feel from them and what we can understand from them. I guess basically in the end, what I'm kind of coming at with this is that when we're examining media, the context that media exists in does matter in terms of what part of our brains and what part of our psyche it's meant to engage with. And trying to treat a series like Kingdom Hearts like, it's Game of Thrones and things are supposed to logically lead one thing to the next just feels like trying to force a square peg into a round hole. Anyway, I think that's pretty much all I had in mind for this whole topic. Any of my Kingdom Hearts fans out there, I hope it just gave you something new or a little bit different to think about regarding the series. Again, there's so much material in this series and there's so much to love. So I think it's always worthwhile to go back and re-examine the narratives that have really impacted us. Thank you for joining me on this fun little strange journey. I don't know when the next video will be or what it'll be about, but I'm enjoying making these. Like I said, I'm still learning a lot about the process of making this type of video, so bear with me, but keep an eye out for the next one. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful day.